Shalom, shalom. This is Sunday, July the 5th, first day of the week, day after Shabbat. This is Daniel John Lee with Torah Restoration Ministries. Making this video, The Riddle of King Cyrus, Daniel's 70 weeks, and I'm doing a corrected version because my changed rather to create this new video. So originally what I believed was that, of course, that Yahshua was going to return in 2017, the next Jubilee, and that did not happen. I've revised my opinion to believe now that the Great Tribulation, rather 2017, the Jubilee, actually begins, and that the final 3.5 years, or the Great Tribulation, it's described in Revelation, occurs from the spring of 2017 until the fall of 2020. Not only is that the 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation, but it's the final half of Daniel's 7th week. The first half, I believe, occurred 2,000 years ago during Yahshua's ministry, from the year 13 AD until 17 AD. Now, why do I believe that? Well, let's go to Daniel chapter 9, and starting in verse 24. It says, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression, and to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Now, that Hebrew word there is not literally weeks, it's Shavua, which means 70 weeks of years. So literally 490 years are determined. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem. Okay, now again, there were two different decrees issued by two different kings. One, the first one was issued by Xerxes I to rebuild the temple. That is not the one that we want to count from, because here it's very clear that the decree is issued to rebuild Jerusalem. That one was not issued for another 20 years by his son Artaxerxes I. So that's the one we want to go by. Sometimes people get confused. So know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, or 49 years, and 62 weeks, or 434 years. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. So Daniel right here in verse 25 says that there's two periods of time between the going forth of the commandment to rebuild Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince. And that's a period of time of 7 weeks, or 49 years, and a period of 62 weeks, or 434 years. So a total of 483 years from this decree that will be issued to rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah the Prince. Now notice there's been no mention of Yahshua being cut off, the Messiah being cut off. So you cannot possibly end the 69 weeks when Yahshua was cut off in 17 AD, which is what my timeline originally said when I made this a couple years ago. And so basically what that means is that the 69 weeks has to end in 13, the fall of 13 AD, when he begins his ministry, because unto Messiah the Prince would mean unto the time when people start recognizing Yahshua as the Messiah, which would be when he starts his ministry in the fall of 13 AD. Well, my original timeline, of course, had the 69 weeks ending in 17, not 13, so that violates the text. So I have to figure out how I can shift the timeline back a few years so that that 69 weeks terminates in the fall of 13 AD rather than the spring of 17, because that's the only interpretation that will fit this text. Now, moving on. The next half is going to explain why I believe there's a 2,000-year gap between the first half of Daniel's 70th week and the last half. And also, keep in mind, you have the 7-year period, which I'm about to read about. The 7-year period mentioned in the book of Daniel, it's the 70th and last week of Daniel's 70 weeks. And you have it clearly defined in Daniel, but when you go to the New Testament and Revelation, there is no 7-year period. Go from the beginning of Matthew 1 all the way to the end of Revelation 22, you will not find a single mention of a 7-year period, but you will see several mentions of a 3.5-year period, or 42 months, or 1,260 days. Well, why is that? I believe that because between the events of the book of Daniel and the events described in Revelation, the first half of that 7-year period was fulfilled in the Gospels by Yahshua's ministry. And I believe that's the clear answer to that riddle. So why is there this huge gap? Well, the gap is talked about right here, starting in verse 26. And after 62 weeks, so after the 62 weeks, which also came after the 7 weeks, so after this 69-week period, or 483-year period, shall Messiah be cut off. So the 69 weeks clearly have already ended when Messiah is cut off. It's not when it ends, but it's after. It's after it ends. So that means Messiah is cut off sometime in the 70th week. Messiah is cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. That's 70 AD. So those events clearly happened 2,000 years ago. It's describing when Yahshua is crucified. It's describing when the general Titus, under the Roman emperor, destroys Jerusalem. These events all happened 2,000 years ago. But then if we go to verse 27, it says, and he, Yahshua, the Messiah, shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. Well, we know he did that 2,000 years ago. He started confirming his covenant when he began his ministry in the fall of 13 AD. He confirmed his covenant with his blood when he died on the tree in the spring of 17 AD. But then it says, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Well, now wait a minute. That never happened. When Yahshua died, or when he confirmed his covenant, he never caused the sacrifice and oblation to cease. The sacrifices continued all the way until 70 AD. And then it says, and for the overspreading of abomination shall he make it desolate. Aha! Here we're talking about the abomination of desolation. Well, that hasn't happened yet. That's an event that's still in the future. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even to the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. So, verse 26 is clearly talking about events that occurred 2,000 years ago. The beginning of verse 27 starts with events that happened 2,000 years ago, but as we continue to read, it goes into events that have not yet happened. So very clearly for Daniel 9, 24 through 27, we can establish two things. Number one, the first 69 weeks of Daniel's 70 weeks go from the decree issued to rebuild Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the Prince, which would be unto when Yahshua begins his ministry. And number two, that there is a time gap between the first half of Daniel's 70th week and the last half of Daniel's 70th week, as typified in verse 26 and verse 27. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and try to go through this timeline, the revised timeline. So this is from what I originally created back in 2013, but now I've updated it. All right, the riddle of King Cyrus, Daniel 70 weeks, 17 CE and 2017 CE, both of which I believe are still Jubilees. Special note, please listen to this YouTube in order to better understand. Yeah, that's the YouTube I'm making right now. That's what I'm going to be inserting in this document. And you'll be able to find this document on my website later today. All right, no scholars dispute that Cyrus the Great began his rule in 559 BC. However, I just found, and this is stuff I did last night today, I just found evidence that he began his reign 2 years earlier in 561 BC. No scholars dispute that Cyrus the Great died in 530 BC. That's accepted universally. No scholars dispute that Darius I began his rule in 522 BC. However, I just found evidence last night and today that Darius I may have actually begun 2 years earlier in 524 BC due to the Persian army disappearing in 524 BC and giving Darius a powerful incentive to move in and take power for himself. And I'll talk about that a little later. No scholars dispute that Xerxes I began his rule in 46 BC. However, according to evidence I found, it is now likely he began his rule in 490 BC to make his 20th year in 470 BC, which is when his son, Artaxerxes I, began his reign due to new evidence I found. Scholars found Nebuchadnezzar ruled for 43 years and died in the 44th year of his reign. They just have him in the wrong 43 years. And then I cite all the historical sources for this information. Now, here's what I did last night and today to correct the timeline and try to shift it back a few years so that 69 weeks ends in 13 AD rather than 17 AD to harmonize with Daniel 9. First of all, I wanted to re-verify Darius II's reign. Now, Darius II is the character mentioned in Ezra 5 and Ezra 6. Ezra 6 is where the temple is finally finished. It's been built for years, and it's finally finished under Darius II. That's the Darius mentioned in Ezra 6. So he's a very important character scripturally. And the text in Ezra chapter 6 says that it's in the 6th year of Darius II's reign that temple's finished. So we really need to pinpoint when the 6th year happened so we can find out when that very significant event occurred. So after reading more carefully in the Wikipedia article, which I based my first timeline on, the king before him died on December the 25th, 424, but Darius II did not take his throne for another 1.5 months due to Xerxes II. So, seemed to suggest Darius II didn't come to power until early 423, which is what I had on my original timeline. However, the above may not be exactly correct due to what I found in another document here. Darius II ascended the throne after the short reigns of two of his half-brothers. Xerxes II actually ruled from 425 to 424, and Saguenus ruled in 424. In the dating formulas, now this is very important, in the dating formulas of the Babylonian business documents, however, these kings are not mentioned, and Darius II directly succeeds Artaxerxes I. So in other words, the way it was documented is that Xerxes II and his brother Saguenus reigned, the time that they reigned actually became incorporated. It became absorbed into Darius II's reign. Thus, per the documents, Darius II began his reign in 425 BC, not 423 BC, as I have on my original timeline. Thus, the 6th year would be from some date in 420 BC to some date in 419 BC. Since Ezra VI mentions Adar, which always happens to be in February, March of the year, we can safely assume the temple was finished in February, March of 420 BC to ensure it falls within the 6th year of Darius II. So already I'm able to start shifting my timeline backwards. Now, I discovered a document I will mention later in which it suggests Artaxerxes I began his reign in 470 BC. This would be the year then that he issues the decree to rebuild Jerusalem and the beginning of Daniel's 70 weeks. And you can read about this in Nehemiah chapter 2. In fact, him issuing such a powerful decree indicates that this was his first act to mark the beginning of his rulership, distinct from his father who would die a few years later. Even though the temple is not finished until 50 years after that, the first 7 weeks of Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy, 49 years, would be completed in 421 BC. Now let's go 62 weeks of years, or 434 years from Aviv, 421 BC. Well, 433 years is complete in Aviv of 13 AD. Thus, by the time Yahshua begins his ministry in the fall of 13 AD, we are well into the 434th year, or 62 weeks of years. Now, I discovered a book called The Chronology of the Old Testament by Floyd Nolan Jones that suggested Artaxerxes actually started his reign in 470 BC. Now, in actual fact, young Artaxerxes co-reigned with his father, Xerxes I, for 20 years, from 490 BC to 470 BC, and 470 BC marked Artaxerxes' first year of rulership distinct from his father, who would die a few years later. This is why 470 BC can be both the first year, as recorded by Floyd Nolan Jones, and the 20th year, as described in Nehemiah 2. Now, I'm going to take a break here before I keep reading. Now, if you go to Wikipedia, you go to historical resources, everyone says, no, actually Xerxes I and Artaxerxes didn't start until 486, because you still had Darius I ruling until 486. But I just discovered an interesting historical fact. In the year 490, Darius I sent his Persian army to try to defeat the Athenians. And it was the Battle of Marathon. And the Athenians wound up defeating the Persians and killing over 6,000 of them, while the Athenians, which had a much smaller army, only lost like a little less than 200 men. So it was a humiliating defeat. And what I suspect is in that Battle of Marathon, because Darius I had such a humiliating defeat, that perhaps at that point Xerxes I, who took on the title of his grandfather, Cyrus the Great, decided to kill Darius I and take over in 490. Which, again, this would kind of be Darius I basically reaping what he had sown, and we're going to read about that in just a moment. Okay, the remainder of the timeline can be adjusted by beginning Nebuchadnezzar's reign in 577 BC rather than 575, because again, we don't know. We know he reigned for 43 years and died in his 44th year. We just don't know when those years were. If we place his reign starting in 577 BC, then the 69 weeks of Daniel finishes out in 13 AD. Another problem happens if we shift things back to start in 577 BC rather than 575 BC. Namely, Cyrus the Great is supposed to begin his reign in 559, not 561, as the timeline would now dictate. However, it looks like Cyrus the Great might have indeed begun his reign in 561 BC because of what I found here. Wikipedia says Cyrus's reign ended in December 530 BC, and his reign was between 29 to 31 years long. So that would mean his reign could have begun in 561 BC. So there we have proof that it very likely it began in 531. One last problem arises. Darius I is supposed to have begun his reign in 522 BC, but in my revised timeline, this would be shifted back to 524 BC. All historical documents record Cambyses II dying in 522 BC and Darius I beginning in 522 BC. However, I would like to put forth an alternative. If you Google Cambyses II and 524 BC, you will find a host of articles about how his entire Persian army disappeared in 524 BC in the deserts of Egypt. Is it possible, due to this overwhelming loss of 50,000 Persian troops, that Darius I took matters into his own hands and murdered Cambyses II, otherwise known as Belshazzar, in 524 BC, which is what's recorded in the book of Daniel, the same year his entire army vanished without a trace? I think it highly probable. So this is what I was talking about Darius I reaping what he had sown. You know, he decides in 524 to murder the ruler because of the ruler's humiliating defeat and loss of men. And then later in 490 BC, Darius I suffers the same fate when he suffers a humiliating defeat with his army, and Xerxes I takes the throne from him. So here's the corrected timeline in full. All right, so we have in the year 577 BC, Nebuchadnezzar begins his reign. And this is King Jehoiakim's of Judah's third year. And this is recorded in Daniel 1, verse 1. In 576 is when Daniel chapter 2 takes place. And then in 575, Jehoiakim rebels against Babylon's rule after 3 years. That's recorded in 2 Kings 24:1. Then we skip down to the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar in 570. Jehoiakim has ruled 10 years, and in his 11th year is killed by Nebuchadnezzar. It's recorded in 2 Kings 23:36 and 24:6. Jehoiakim then is installed and ruled for 3 months and was taken in the 8th year of King Nebuchadnezzar. Then the following year, Zedekiah becomes king and is attacked by Nebuchadnezzar in his 9th year. 561 is when Cyrus the Great begins ruling. Persia does not conquer Babylon until Darius, according to Daniel 531. So you have the Persian Empire and Babylonian Empire coexisting here. Then we skip down to the 19th year, which began in 559 BC and stretches to 558 BC. And in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, according to 2 Kings 25:8 and 9, the temples burned to the ground. Zedekiah is taken captive in the 11th year of his reign. So now the 70 years of captivity, we know it was 70 years as Jeremiah prophesied. 70 years begins when the temple is burned to the ground in 558 BC. So now we're going to go through the 70 years of captivity. 533 is when Nebuchadnezzar dies, and Daniel chapter 7 takes place. Then after Nebuchadnezzar dies, we have 10 years of his son Belshazzar ruling. Cyrus the Great dies there. In the 10th year of Belshazzar is in 524 BC. This is when Darius the First slays Belshazzar, or Cambyses II, and takes over Babylon. Now this is an interesting year, 524 BC. It's been now 34 years, and by that summer of 524 BC, it'll start the 35th year. So halfway through the 70 years. And we know from Daniel 9:1 that it is in the first year of Darius that he makes his prayer to Yah for the people to return to Jerusalem and Judah. So Daniel made this prayer sometime early on or after September, which means in the 35th year of the captivity. 35 is exactly half of 70. So literally in the midst of the 70-year captivity, right in the middle, Daniel makes his prayer. So I thought that was pretty cool. Now, how do I know Belshazzar ruled for 10 years between Nebuchadnezzar's death and when Darius I takes over? Well, if you go to that source there, and again, I will put this on my website, ancient cuneiform text indicates that Nabonidus, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, lived in Tema, North Arabia for approximately 10 years. During that decade, Belshazzar ruled Babylon as his father's regent. So there we go. And then we continue with the 70-year exile, the Jews in Babylon. Now we come to the 68th year. After this, this is in 490 BC. This is when Darius I suffers that huge defeat by the Athenian army. and when I believe now that Xerxes I comes to power. In the 68 years of the 70-year exile, Xerxes I, who takes the name of his grandfather, Cyrus the Great, issues the Ezra chapter 1 decree to rebuild the temple in the first year of his reign. Artaxerxes I, a young boy at the time, his son, also begins to co-reign with his father. Following year, in 489, after 69 years of captivity, we have the events in Ezra 3, 1 through 7. And then in 488 BC, now this is 70 years, have now elapsed of exile, and the exile officially ends, which is marked by the foundation of the temple being laid. This happens in the month of May. Events in Ezra 3, 8 through 13, the foundation of the temple is laid, temple construction begins. Now, some people may say, now wait a minute, why do you have the 70-year exile ending when the temple, when the foundation of the temple is laid, and not when they leave Babylon 2 years earlier? Well, the reason I believe this is true is because, think about it, the 70-year exile began not when people first started leaving Jerusalem, because Daniel was taken as a captive several years before the temple was burned to the ground, as we showed in the timeline. But the 70-year exile began when the temple was burned to the ground. So would it not make sense that the 70 years end when the foundation of a new temple is laid? And so that's why I think that this is true. So the temple construction begins, foundations laid. Then in Ezra 4, 1 through 4, enemies of Judah frustrate their purpose. Daniel's chapters 10, 11, and 12 take place. All events of the book of Nehemiah are between Ezra 4:4 and Ezra 4:24. So now, so things kind of stop. They lay the foundation, but things stop because the enemies of Judah persecute them. And then 20 years later, we're skipping now to Nehemiah chapter 2 in 470 BC. And this again is where that book that I found, that I mentioned earlier, says that Artaxerxes begins his reign. 470 BC, 20th year of Xerxes I and his son Artaxerxes I, or also the first year of his reign, because this is when he comes into his own. This is when Nehemiah 2, verse 5 occurs, and the decree is issued to build the city of Jerusalem. This is when the 70 weeks of Daniel begin. So the events of Nehemiah chapter 2 through 9 all happen in 470 BC. 469 BC is the first year of Daniel's 70 weeks has elapsed. In the second year, third year, fourth year, Xerxes I dies, and now Artaxerxes rules alone. 6th, 7th, 8th, we're going through all the years now. Nehemiah 13, 6 through 7 happens in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes I. And now we go through these years until we get to... Now, when we get to the 45th year of Daniel's 70 weeks, we find that Artaxerxes dies. There's the brief reign of Xerxes II and Saguenus, but these two kings are removed from history, and Darius II's reign begins retroactively. So then we come to the second year of Darius II's reign, events of Ezra 4:24, Ezra 5, 1 through 17, and Ezra 6, 1 through 14. 46 years of Daniel's 7 weeks have elapsed. Come to 423 BC, which is the third year of Darius II. 47 years have elapsed since Daniel's 70 weeks began. 422 is 48 years, and then 421 is when the first 49 years of Daniel's 70 weeks have elapsed, or 7 weeks of years. So this is when our first portion of time, as described in Daniel 9, ends. So from 470 to 421 is 49 years, or 7 weeks. 7 weeks of years. Then the following year, 50 years into the Daniel 70 weeks, we now come finally to the 6th year of Darius II and the events of Ezra 6, 15 through 22, where the temple is finished. So it's interesting that the prophecy shows that there's 49 years, there's 7 weeks of years, and the following year we got the temple finished. So you got that 49 chunk, and then after that 49 years of troublesome times are done, then you have the temple being finished. Now, then you want to go 62 weeks of years later, or 430 years later, unto Messiah the Prince. Not from 420, because that was outside the 49 years, but from 421, because 421 is when the 49 years was finished. And remember, we had a chunk of 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So 49 years from 470 to 421, and then another 434 years from 421, which brings us to 13 AD. In 13 AD or CE, Yahshua begins his ministry. And this is in the fall of 13 CE, which is literally 433 and a half years after the first 49 years completed in 421 BC. So in the 434th year, right in the midst of it, or 62 weeks of year, Messiah begins his ministry. Now, some may dispute that 430 years are not complete at this point, but remember, Hebrew is not like Western mindset, and prophecy is organic, not always exact. Being in the 434th year is close enough for me to say that 69 or 483 years of years have been fulfilled between the decree issued to rebuild Jerusalem in early spring 470 BCE and the fall of 13 AD. Now we come to Daniel's 70th week, the last and final week of the 70 weeks. In the fall of 13 CE, the 70th week of Daniel begins and Yahshua's ministry begins. Yahshua then has a ministry throughout 14, 15, 16, up until the spring of 17 CE when Pliny records that major earthquake in the Middle East. Yahshua is cut off and rises again. 17 CE is a Jubilee year. This is the first 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week being fulfilled. Then, according to verses 26 and 27 of Daniel 9, we have that gap. I believe it's a 2,000 year or 40 Jubilee gap until 2017 CE in the spring, where we have the last 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week beginning, which begins on a Jubilee, and there's the Great Tribulation. So we have the first 3.5 years ending on a Jubilee, and the last 3.5 years beginning on a Jubilee. Perfect mirror. In 2020 CE, 3.5 years later, in the fall, Daniel's 70th week comes to an end, and Yahshua returns. The resurrection occurs on Yom Teruah 2020 AD, which happens to be September 18th, 2020, Friday. Now, from 470 BC to 17 CE, there are exactly 10 Jubilees encompassed in those years. Okay, and I list them here. So the first 69.5 weeks of Daniel's 70-week prophecy encompasses 10 Jubilees. Now, there are 40 Jubilees between the completion of the 69.5 weeks and the remainder of Daniel's 70th week in the year 2020. And why? Well, not only because I show the time gap, but the reason why there's 40 Jubilees, as Moshe went up to the top of Mount Sinai for 40 days, so Yahshua goes to the heavenly Mount Zion for 40 Jubilees. As Yahshua was tested in the wilderness for 40 days, so his elect are tested for 40 Jubilees between Daniel's 69.5 weeks and the completion of the 70th week. As Yahshua in his resurrected body taught his disciples for 40 days from first fruits of 17 CE until the 40th Omer of 17 CE, so Yahshua by his Spirit teaches his elect for 40 Jubilees between the 69.5 weeks and completion of Daniel's 70th week. So Daniel's 70 weeks encompasses 50 Jubilees in total. In every cycle there are 49 years, and the 50th year is a Jubilee, a year of freedom. Well, now we have 50 Jubilees in Daniel's 70 weeks. The 50th Jubilee is 2017, which is a Jubilee of Jubilees. It will be the Jubilee in which the saints flee to the safe place, as described in Revelation 12, and the 3.5 year Great Trib begins. Then we continue with this timeline in the BC era, just to finish out the book of Ezra. Darius II dies, and Artaxerxes II starts his reign in 405. And then in 399, we have the 7th year of Artaxerxes II, which Ezra 7 occurs. And this is when Ezra goes back to Jerusalem in the summertime. And then there's more mention of it during Hanukkah. And then the following year in 398 is again more mentions in Ezra. So that just finishes out the timeline. So in total, there's 2,490 years from 470 BC until the 70 weeks of Daniel is completed in 2020. 2490 is a real interesting number because the Hebrew word, if you go to the Strong's Concordance, the Hebrew word 2490 is kalal, which means to defile, to desecrate, to pollute, to pierce. And it looks like from the time that the decree was issued to rebuild Jerusalem unto when Yahshua returns in 2020, there's 2,490 years of pollution, desecration, defilement. In the year 2490 BC is likely right around the time when the flood occurred. 2,490 years after the creation is likely when the Exodus occurred. So that number 2490 is a very interesting number. It seems to come up a lot. So this is the completed timeline of Daniel's 70 weeks. It's now been corrected It all fits together now, so that first 3.5 years of the last week occurs from the fall of 13 AD till the spring of 17 AD, Yahshua's ministry. And then after a 2,000-year gap, the final half of Daniel's 70th week, 3.5 years, occurs from spring 2017 till the fall of 2020. So, thank you for listening, and I hope this explains a lot. I do want to make it clear, though, that although I do believe now that the return of Yahshua will be in 2020, the fall of 2020, I'm not going to go and say, "Thus saith Yah," or anything like that. I'm just saying this is my belief. This is my belief based off the evidence in Scripture, based off historical data, based off the timeline and how the 70 weeks works, based off the passage in Daniel 9. This is what I firmly believe now. So, be a good Berean and compare what I believe to Scripture and see if this bears witness with your spirit. This is Daniel John Lee with Torah Restoration Ministries, website spiritandtorah.com. I will, once I have this timeline uploaded to the website, I'll provide a link under this video to that timeline so you can go over it at your own leisure. And then also, when you go to that link, I'll put this video at the very top so you can watch that from there. All right, thank you so much. Shalom.